Greetings, everyone, and welcome to another edition of AUHSD Future Talks. I'm your host, Superintendent Michael Matsuda, the superintendent of the Anaheim Union High School District with nearly 29,000 students across 5 cities. And as our audience knows, this show is dedicated to the future of education, the future of work, and even the future of our country. And we've been so lucky and blessed to have many amazing, incredible leaders, including our own students. But today we do have a big fish, as they say, Mr. Alex Chough, who oversees an organization we're going to learn more about called NCCEP. Alex, welcome to our show.
Thanks, Mike. Thanks for having me. I'm just really gratified to have the opportunity to spend some time with you.
Well, as everybody knows, we always start with sort of who you are and what are your drivers. So can you share a little bit about, Alex, your journey?
Sure. I suspect like anyone who's got a role to play within kind of the education ecosystem, my principal driver is quite personal. When I think about the arc of my family's story, education is front and center, and it's front and center in a very complicated way, Mike. It's not, it's not without its downside. So both of my parents are deaf, and my father was born in the 1930s in Korea, where being born deaf was akin to just being locked out of any genuine opportunities, right, in life. Right, so his own education experience was short. He, despite the fact that he mastered many languages, he was finished with education when he was 14. He became a teacher when he was 16, and then the Korean War arrived, and that opened some doors that would otherwise not be there in Korea. That ultimately motivated him to come to the United States and pursue post-secondary education at Gallaudet University here in Washington, D.C., which was at the time the only university in the world for the deaf and hard of hearing, right? So it was a beacon of hope for him to come here. My mom was born here in the United States, but she was, like my father, born profoundly deaf. And in her time, in the 1950s America, if you were born deaf, you were taken from your family, essentially. So she went to a residential school in New York State. And the entire educational philosophy at that time was to prohibit the use of American Sign Language. So if she was caught, signing to her classmates, right, which is, her first and natural language, there was a glass of water on her desk, and her teacher would literally dump that glass of water on her head as a means of,
oh my gosh,
effectively training her not to sign and just to rely on lip reading and vocalization. And so when I think about both of my parents, I mean, education, had one foot in trauma, right? But what happened was this: they both found opportunity in a really unexpected place, in higher education, in fact. And they found a culture and a climate where they could not only, pursue their academic dreams, explore, academic subjects with a level of intensity and seriousness that they were deprived earlier in their education, but they were encouraged to be their truest selves, to kind of embrace their identity, embrace their culture, embrace their deafness. And both my parents have really gone on to do incredible things. And, higher education was always the center of that. It was, for them, education was both, a source of tremendous pain, but also the catalyst for everything great that they were able to achieve in life. And, their experience, kind of mirrors mine a little bit. When I think back to, when I was an adolescent, I mean, Mike, I'll be honest with you, I was a total knucklehead. I might have been the worst student. I might have been the worst behaved child at the school, but, we had, I don't know, I want to say when I was about 14 or so, I just, I had heard so many times what a bad person I was, how wasn't right for school, that I really started to believe it, and I had a very conflicted relationship with education, obviously. But I had a teacher, his name was Mr. Patrick, and, he saw something, that others perhaps overlooked, or, maybe they believed what they were being told by their peers. And, he literally essentially forced me to go into dual enrollment. And the weirdest thing happened, Mike. I went to a college campus here in Northern Virginia, a local community college. And from day one, I just, it's like I found myself there, right? Just being able to engage with the academics in a slightly different way, having a lot more flexibility, having just a lot more freedom to, engage in intellectual pursuits. And I'll never forget, I had to turn in my college report card to get my high school grades. I turned it into the principal, and he was expecting, the C's and D's and F's that I'd always had in high school. And I handed him a report card of college level courses where I was getting straight A's. And he was like, we misread you, right? And, when I went on to, away from community college, and I went to the University of New Mexico, and I was studying linguistic anthropology as a major, and I had the opportunity to engage with some indigenous tribes around language preservation. And when I saw the lack of opportunities, and was hearing stories about the lack of opportunity and the lack of access to education, it really fired me up as a principle of social betterment, right? So I was always just really, what drives me is really just this idea that education is complicated, right? And how institutions interact with individuals is complicated. But if we leverage the right things, we can just, make opportunity, happen at scale. And so that's what brought me into education.
Wow. What you described is, I think, what so many of our kids, especially kids of color, but many kids and adolescents, trying to figure out who they are and their own sense of self-worth reflected in their motivation and their performance. So that lived experience, I think, really does explain why you've become such an effective and influential leader. Could you tell us a little bit about this organization, NCCEP, and your involvement with it?
Yeah, thank you, Mike. So NCCEP, as we're known in the Beltway, the National Council for Community Education Partnerships. We're a not-for-profit association. Our members include state agencies of K-12 and higher education, institutions of higher education all over the country, and many K-12 school districts. And they are brought together because they are all recipients of a federal grant called Gear Up. And the goal of Gear Up is complicated, but very straightforward. It is, how do we create partnerships between K-12, higher ed, community, and business leaders to set a strategic agenda to strengthen the pathway to college and career for students who have been, historically underrepresented in higher education. So primarily first-generation students of color, rural students, and other students that have been, effectively marginalized when it comes to opportunity. So what we do at NCCEP is threefold. First and foremost, our members rely on us to help foster the right public policies at the federal level to ensure that the resources that Europe provides goes from Congress to the U.S. Department of Education to our grant recipients all over the country. So that's kind of where I cut my teeth career-wise within the education domain. I wish I was talented enough to work with students, but I'm not. So I get by working with the White House and Congress and other folks that are probably a little easier to work with than students. And so what we do is we just, we work really hard on the advocacy, the lobbying domain, and et cetera. In addition to that, we work to foster, just an environment in which best practices and effective practices are disseminated far and wide, right? So the Gear Up model has a number of requirements, but also best practices that we know can really catalyze student outcomes, but also can expand opportunity in the post-secondary and career domain for students. And then really the third major thrust of our organization is around research and evaluation, right? We we know that these types of interventions, they have an impact, sometimes good, sometimes negative. So we have always long believed that evidence can play a powerful guide. So what we do is we work with, the Gearing community is huge, right? So we're talking about 156 grants serving, almost 600,000 students in almost 3,500 K-12 schools across the country. And so what we're trying to do is organize our communities so that they can do all the things necessary to address weaknesses in the college-going pipeline, the pipeline to career, and et cetera. And that really requires a multifaceted approach.
That's a mouthful. And it is a big program, and it's a big national program, and to be able to manage something like that in this very divisive world that we have politically, and certainly a very challenging world ahead. So a lot of the focus of Gear Up is preparing kids for college and career.
Mm-hmm.
You, in your own sense of it, what is the difference, or is there a difference between college and career readiness?
Well, I mean, I think a conversation could be had about kind of what the empirical evidence says, right? And if you look at like research that ACT and other academic organizations have done, where they map the relationship between academic achievement with the skills and knowledge and behaviors that employers are looking for, I think that empirical evidence says, those standards are effectively, if they're not the same, they're remarkably similar, right, in terms of academic proficiency. But we also know we don't live in an empirical world, right? So when I think about the students that we get the pleasure of working with, I think too often that they hear that it's college or career, right? That these are two tracks that don't interface or they don't cross over with one another. When in fact, at worst, college and career are two different sides of the same coin, right? Mm-hmm. And especially when we think about what how the world is trending and the jobs of the future, and how do we develop students with the right skills and mindsets and academic competencies to thrive in jobs and careers that don't even exist yet. We have to treat college and career holistically as being deeply connected. Because I think fundamentally what people what students and families are looking for is they're looking for a leg up, right? It's for them, it's not a matter of education equity, it's a matter of economic equity as well, right? And so just making sure that students and families make decisions that are favorable to their long-term prospects early in the student's career, I mean, that's really hard work, right? And that's kind of why Gear Up exists and why it starts in middle school, right? We really start addressing these issues.
The PTA does a national survey of its members every year, and there's a disturbing trend that's not surprisingly, but it's a very disturbing trend that this generation of American parents, for the first time ever, don't believe their kids are going to do better than they have. Because every successive generation, there's surely, there's a lot of evidence that we've gotten better, we've gotten richer, we've gotten stronger and more successful. Mm-hmm. But this is the first generation that are saying, hey, maybe that's not true. Do you think the American dream is still accessible to young people?
Can I be candid, Mike? I have real doubts about the status quo of the American dream, in the sense that when you look at the underlying cost of education, the underlying cost of higher education, what it costs for health insurance, what it costs for to rent or to buy a home, and all of these things relative to how wages have responded, right? I mean, there's a real tension, I think, in our society right now about that. So I'm skeptical. I think the American dream that drove my dad to make the long journey from Korea to the United States, or the American dream that drove my mom to, have to overcome so much, to be able to, pursue higher education and these really rewarding careers. I think the underlying value propositions have changed, right? And so I think there's this real tension right now. And, part of me is deeply sympathetic to the world that our students will be facing, and I'm deeply concerned about it. But on the other hand, I'm actually quite encouraged by, I think, what our younger future leaders are thinking about. And if I could try to explain it succinctly, whenever I get the opportunity to engage about what their dreams are, I start to realize that their dreams are not the same as my parents' dreams.
Interesting. Yes.
That maybe it's not that the American dream is weakening or it's vanishing. It's that we need to create a better dream. And the one thing that I will say that I'm so encouraged by, let's say, my younger colleagues or the many high school and college students that I get to meet, is the things that they value are just very different than, let's say, what preceding generations value. And maybe it's not about material things. Maybe it's more about a sense of purpose, a sense of belonging, a sense of identity, a sense of connectedness that they really value. That maybe in the long run, obviously we have to rectify some of the inequities that we see. And then we'll probably spend the rest of our lives doing that. But I think there's an opportunity to rethink things, and I'm excited by what these, Generation Z and following, how they define success. It's really important to me.
That's a very profound observation that you've just shared. What does that mean? And I would agree with what you're saying, but no one has quite said it the way you just said it. What does that mean for institutions that have been preparing kids for that past American dream?
Yeah. Well, I think it's profound, and I so much. And part of the tension is this: the American dream has just been so profoundly successful for so many people that it has achieved kind of mythological status, and the extent to which our institutions and our policies are still anchored to this proposition that if you work really, really hard, it's gonna pay off in a really big way. That is a quintessential American thing, right? It speaks to our Western culture. It speaks to a lot of different values and things. For our institutions, let me use your district as an example. So many districts have made such a deep commitment to, thinking about college career readiness as kind of a linear path, that they have effectively, really closed the door. And I don't think they did it intentionally. I just think that they're trying to do their best. They've really closed the door to kind of alternative approaches where we think about a student's experience really holistically, right? And so part of what is going on in Anaheim that I'm so excited about is this, real emphasis that, education is a catalyst, and yes, you absolutely have to develop important academic skills, right, to succeed. But there's a lot more to a person's character than, their ability to interact effectively with content, right? There's things related to character and citizenship and critical thinking and SEL and all of these things. And the challenge for so many schools is how do we personalize that in a way where, especially when you're dealing with adolescents that are, really going through transformational physiological changes, and biological and psychological changes, how do we nurture them as a whole rather than how do we just nurture them academically? And when I think about so many of the Gear Up alumni that we've gotten to know and actually have observed how they've done professionally for the last 10 or 15 years now that they've been out of Gear Up and they've been out of college. And the one thing that they all have in common is this incredible entrepreneurial spirit. I mean, they all did the right things, but they have a degree of they're playing by slightly different rules, right? They're much more entrepreneurial. I think much more vested in pursuing goals that are, meet their personal needs. That might be emotional balance, it might be emotional well-being, it might be all these other types of things. And how do we foster that sense of identity, early and often? That's a real challenge for us. Pretty incoherent answer there, Mike, but I think we're all trying to figure it out, right?
Well, I think what Europe offers is sort of and the maybe the opportunity of this pandemic is to transform and reinvent and become more entrepreneurial. And I think that definitely we're seeing that with some of the. It's surprising, kind of that energy that's coming out of the Gear Up community in terms of this annual conference coming up next month. I understand it's the biggest in ever, right, in the industry. How do you explain for that? Because on the one hand, we've been told that teachers and educators are so worn, they don't want to do anything and they're tired. But here we are coming up to July, and we have this big conference, and there seems to be so much energy.
There's so much energy, and I don't dismiss the idea that they're tired. I'm sure they're going to be quite exhausted on the flight out. But, I think, first and foremost, what the pandemic has done is I think it's challenged everybody's assumptions about how Gear Up should work and how education should work and how we should foster career readiness. The work of Gear Up has been, about establishing an implementation model in like the late 90s and incrementally improving on that. But what the pandemic has done is really upend, effectively all of the assumptions that undergird not only Gear Up, but the levers we have at our disposal to work effectively with students. So my hunch about why there's so much enthusiasm about our conference, and let's use that as kind of a proxy for, I think, what is a bigger hunger. I can't imagine, I don't think there's ever been an event as disruptive as the pandemic on the fundamental tenets of education. And obviously you and your colleagues have done an extraordinary job, navigating that. But I'm not sure everybody feels like they have all the answers, right? Like if we challenge our assumptions enough, if each of us in our own way have to approach the daily work, through a completely different approach, we want to share and learn from each other, right? And that's really been a big negative byproduct of the pandemic. It's just like this complete absence of connectedness and this real strong sense of isolation among educators across the country. So to have the opportunity to come together with, educators from Alaska, New York, all over the country, right, to talk about our shared and lived experiences, what did we learn? What does this mean? How do we change? These are big, meaty questions that I think people are anxious to discuss. And there's just really not a lot of forums for us to do that. So being able to create this forum and to be able to do it in person after years of being away, I think people are just excited to find a sense of purpose and a sense of renewal, being part of a bigger community, that really cares for, in a very deep and genuine way about what people are doing. I think people are excited.
I think it says a lot about Gear Up's branding and you and your team, Betty, Alex, and just the amazing staff that you have. But, we kind of started out with this conversation about the need to belong and be part of something greater than ourselves. I think that says a lot about Gear Up. And it also says about your leadership too, Alex. You're such a humble man, this servant leadership, and but still grounded in vision and moving forward. In the last minute or so, what message do you have to students and educators at this time?
Well, to all of the educators in Anaheim, from our district level staff, our teachers, our counselors, our custodial staff, everybody. it is not lost on us the tremendous personal sacrifices that every single educator has made over the past 2 years to, make the best out of an impossible situation. And I can't conclude, the hundreds of conversations I have with educators a year, without believing that, I think there's just a broad sense of, boy, we did our best, but boy, we're still falling short. And that is a reflection of how serious, the impact of the pandemic has had on students and families, their economic well-being, their mental health, all of, the litany of factors. But imagine what this would be like if we didn't have your teachers, Mike, or we didn't have your counselors, if we didn't have the extraordinary people who've gone, to remarkable lengths to try to meet the needs of students and families in an incredibly unpredictable time. I cannot believe how effectively educators pivoted, adapted, and fundamentally changed how they approach the work as a result of the pandemic. Not knowing when this pandemic is going to end, I think, obviously, I don't believe we're just going to go back to the way things were, right? So I think it's incumbent upon all of us, practitioner all the way to policy folks, thinking about education is, based on everything we know about the human experience and how to nurture the well-being of our students and families, I hope the next couple of years, the next 5 years or so, can be really focused on reinvention. Our values, I think, will remain true to what they were before the pandemic, but, I think our philosophies, our theories of action, I think our day-to-day operations, I think we need to be open to adaptation and evolution. And I know from a GERA perspective, that's really where we're going to be focusing on. Is not just trying to reclaim the past, but to try to, reinvent a brighter future in which, the pathway to success for students, it's easier for them to walk and easier for them to navigate. So I just wish everybody there in Anaheim the absolute best in doing so, and I'll be watching. I'm really just so excited about all the innovations you guys have on your way. So thank you.
Well, thank you, Alex, and on behalf of our 29,000 students and their families. Thank you and your team for your leadership. And I think more than ever, people they need to trust in their institutions. And you are an amazing person, an amazing leader, and thank you for your leadership.
Well, thank you. The feeling is mutual, Mike. So I appreciate the opportunity to get a chance to chat with you here. And obviously, if anybody at Anaheim wants to talk, I'm always here. So please make sure my contact information is available, and we're here to help out wherever we can. We got some great tools.